Happy Tuesday, y'all. How are you? Aren't you excited for another English class? I am certainly glad to be here. I wish we were in the classroom, but we're not, so this is the next best thing. We're going to continue our unit on poetry, and we are on illusion number 8. So I've got a lot to discuss with you, and you have 3 assignments this week, one of them being the discussion board, just like last week. Just a reminder, if you haven't gotten last week's work into me, please get it to me as soon as possible. It truly makes my life a lot harder if I'm trying to grade old work and new work and make phone calls home and emails home to those students who are not doing their work. I just want to touch base with a new policy for those students that are not doing work. You can spread the word to your friends. From administration is that we have to call every student contact on a student's list and send emails to every contact on a student's list for 5 days in a row, and then we pass it on to guidance, and then they go ahead and they do their magic for a while, and then the name gets passed to administration where they make a decision as to what they're going to do and how they're going to handle things. So if you haven't heard yet, if you're not doing work 4th quarter, even if you passed quarters 1, quarters 2, and quarters 3, you will not pass English 10. That's not my rule, that comes from administration. So please spread the word. Enough seriousness. So we're going to start with illusion number 8, and I do have a lot of things to go over with you. This video is probably going to be about 40 minutes long, so make sure that you budget time for that. You don't really need anything except to listen. So illusion number 8 is called Narcissus. A reminder what an illusion is for those of you who maybe haven't tuned in yet to one of my videos. An illusion is a brief and indirect reference to a person, place, thing, idea of historical, cultural, literal, or political significance. It does not describe in detail the person or thing to which it refers. It's just a passing comment, and the writer expects the reader to possess enough knowledge to spot the illusion and grasp its importance in a text. We use illusions in writing to make the writing more interesting and vibrant. We also use them in everyday conversation. So Narcissus is actually a very interesting one. Narcissus is a figure from Greek mythology who is so impossibly handsome that he fell in love with his own image reflected in a pool of water. Narcissus's mother was warned one day by a prophet named Tiresias that her son would live a long life as long as he never knows himself. As he reached his teenage years, the handsome youth never found anyone that could pull his heartstrings. Indeed, he left in his wake a long trail of distressed and heartbroken maidens. Aww. And 1 or 2 young men fell by the wayside too. Then one day, he chanced to see his own reflection in a pool of water and fell in love with himself. Naturally, the one-way relationship went nowhere, and Narcissus, unable to draw himself away from the pool of water, he pined away in despair until he finally died of thirst and starvation. Immortality, at least of a kind, was assured, though when his corpse turned into the flowers which thereafter bore his name. So there actually is a flower called Narcissus as well. And the meaning today is often associated with people who are self-absorbed or think too highly of themselves, especially in regards to their appearance. There's also a personality disorder called narcissism, and it gets its name from this myth of Narcissus. And for all you Harry Potter fans out there, the name Narcissus Malfoy, the mother of Draco, is an allusion to this person, Narcissus. Interesting, huh? So what you're going to have to do in the daily discovery is you're going to have to make a comment like you did last week. I will only give credit for those comments that are relevant and appropriate. I did have to delete one comment last week and someone had to redo it. You have to tell what an example from your own experience, not using names, from a book, from TV, from a video game, or pop culture, where someone is acting like Narcissus, okay? I also want to remind you, when doing an assignment for English, or any class for that matter, even if it's just a daily discovery on a discussion board, you need to edit your work. You're not texting. You are responding to a prompt, so you have to capitalize, you have to punctuate, and you have to check your spelling, okay? So make sure that you're doing that, or I'll have you redo that. All right, so this week's unit on poetry, we are going to be tackling two things. We're going to be tackling a type of poetry called free verse, which is super easy to understand, and it can be tricky to write or easy to write depending on your personality. And we're also going to be working with a literary figurative language called imagery. And that's something that you're familiar with, but I'm going to do some refreshing of your memory. So free verse is basically a type of poetry. And there are two types of poetry. Well, there's lots of different types of poetry, but there's poetry that rhymes and there's poetry that doesn't rhyme, okay? Free verse doesn't rhyme. Free verse is a type of poetry that does not contain rhyme, or what we call meter. And meter is a pattern of rhythm within a poem, and you get that based on the number of syllables in each line and the structure of your words. So free verse is considered an open form of poetry, as opposed to poetry written in a structure or other format, and it tends to follow natural speech patterns and rhythms. While some rhyme and rhythm may occur in a free verse poem, the poet doesn't adhere to a strict pattern. So if you're going to have a rhyme, it can be willy-nilly in the poem, but it shouldn't be a rhyming poem. However, this does not imply that free verse has no guiding principles. Indeed, free verse generally contains poetic lines and poetic imagery that distinguish it from other writing, known as prose. So why do writers use free verse? Let me just read my notes. Generally speaking, formal verse, which is rhyme, gradually fell out of fashion with poets over the course of the 20th century. This was because literacy levels rose. That means people got more educated. And meter and rhyme, which originally was formatted to help with memorization and comprehension, no longer seemed necessary. Does that make sense to you? Rhyming poem is simpler to understand, simpler to memorize, simpler to remember. And so as people got more educated, they didn't need that format. So people moved toward free verse. But free verse was also attractive to poets simply because it lacked restrictions and constraints imposed on poetry by meter and rhyme, and therefore left it to the poet to determine the form his or her poem would take, and to invent his or her own restrictions and constraints. Today it could be said that the main reason most poets write in free verse is simply that it has become the norm, in much the same way that formal verse was once the norm. Now, I have 3 examples that I've chosen of free verse poetry. You won't notice a rhyme to be had. And these are poems that that spoke to me. I particularly liked them. And I didn't put them on Schoology, but you can look them up if you want to, or email me and I'll send you a copy. This is called From Blossoms, and the author is Lee Young Lee. And to show you the structure of this poem, it's a 4-stanza poem, and each stanza has, the first 2 have 5 lines, and the second 2 stanzas have 6 lines, and that's about as much structure as it has. I want you to pay attention to the different types of figurative language in this poem. See if you can find any similes, metaphors, alliteration, hyperbole, and especially imagery. We'll be talking about imagery. And if you don't know what that is, I'll be telling you in a minute. From blossoms. From blossoms comes this brown paper bag of peaches we bought from the boy at the bend in the road where we turned toward signs painted peaches. From laden bounds, from hands, from sweet fellowship in the bins, comes nectar at the roadside, succulent, peaches we devour, dusty skin and all. Comes the familiar dust of summer, dust we eat. Oh, and to take what we love inside, to carry within us an orchard, to eat. Not only the skin, but the shade. Not only the sugar, but the days. To hold the fruit in our hands, adore it, then bite into the round jubilance of peach. There are days we live as if death were nowhere in the background. From joy to joy to joy. From wing to wing. From blossom to blossom. To impossible blossom. To sweet impossible blossom. And that's really just a poem about enjoying the simple things in life and just relishing that. And this is about eating peaches. So this is called From Blossoms by Lee Young Lee, and that is a free verse poem. Another free verse poem that I'm going to be reading is by an author that broke all of the conventional norms earlier in the 1900s. His name is E.E. Cummings. And he happens to be one of my top 5 favorite poets. And E.E. Cummings did not believe in using punctuation. And if he used punctuation, he didn't use it in a conventional sense. He broke every rule of poetry there ever was. And so when he started writing and being published, people were just shocked by what he wrote. Not necessarily the subject matter, but the format that he used. And I'm going to show the camera what this poem looks like, but you're not going to be able to get it unless you look it up. And this is called I Carry Your Heart With Me, I Carry It In by E.E. Cummings. And this is what it looks like. Looks backwards, doesn't it? I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I'm never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear. And whatever is done, my only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you are whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root and the bud of the bud and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. I love that poem. And it's all the much more special when you see how it's formatted. So again, that's an example of free verse poetry, no rhymes. And the last one, oh, I thought I cut it off. It's called There Are Birds Here by Jamal May, and it's dedicated to Detroit. So it's There Are Birds Here. And this is just one long stanza with a lot of different types of line lengths. There are birds here, so many birds here, is what I was trying to say when they said those birds were metaphors for what is trapped between buildings and buildings. No. The birds are here to root around for bread. The girls' hands tear and toss like confetti. No, I don't mean the bread is torn like cotton. I said confetti. And no, not the confetti a tank can make of a building. I mean the confetti a boy can't stop smiling about. And no, his smile isn't much like a skeleton at all. And no, his neighborhood is not like a war zone. I'm trying to say his neighborhood is as tattered and feathered as anything else, as shadow pierced by sun and light parted by shadow dance as anything else. But they won't stop saying how lovely the ruins, how ruined the lovely children must be in that birdless city. And if you know anything about Detroit, Michigan, that poem will make sense to you. And if you don't, look it up, because Detroit has quite a reputation. So those are 3 examples of free verse. Basically, there wasn't any structure, and they varied in topics. One was about a city, and one was about love, and one was about eating peaches. So very, very different. So the next thing we're going to talk about, and then I'll go over the assignments for the week, which we're going to talk about imagery. And I know you're familiar with imagery, but you're going to be using it in your poem this week. So I want to make sure that you are really familiar with it. And I'm going to give you examples of the different types of imagery that you can use, okay? So imagery is a literary device that consists of descriptive language that can function as a way for the reader to better imagine the world of the piece of literature and also adds symbolism to the work. Imagery draws on the 5 senses, namely the details of taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound. Imagery can also pertain to details about movement or a sense of body in motion, or the emotions or sensations of a person, such as fear or hunger. Using imagery helps the reader develop a more fully realized understanding of the imaginary world that the author has created. Imagery examples are prevalent in all types of literature and all cultures from around the world. Poets and novelists and playwrights use imagery for many reasons. One of the key usages is that the imagery in a piece can help create mood, such as a cliched opening like "It was a dark and stormy night." While this line is cliched for any author to actually use it, it's a good example of imagery and that the reader immediately pictures the kind of setting in which the story might take place. The author may use imagery just to help readers understand pieces of work. Details of imagery can often read symbolically. Thunder and lightning that opens a play, or in our novel Lord of the Flies, for example, symbolizes both the storm that is taking over and one is that about to begin in a symbolic way between the tribe and Ralph and Piggy. Thus, when analyzing literature, it's important to consider the imagery used so as to understand both the mood and the symbolism of the piece. So I'm going to go over some examples now. Here's an example of using taste in a piece of writing. And this is from a novel called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And it discusses a character who has an eating disorder where they eat anything. And in this case, she's eating dirt, literal dirt, okay? Those secret tastes, defeated in the past by oranges and rhubarb, broke out into an irrepressible urge when she began to weep. She went back to eating earth. The first time she did it, almost out of curiosity, sure that the bad taste would be the best cure for the temptation. And in fact, she could not bear the earth in her mouth, but she persevered, overcome by the growing anxiety, and little by little she was getting back to her ancestral appetite, the taste of primary minerals, the unbridled satisfaction of what was the original food. So that's about taste, using words, creating images that surround the sense of taste. The second one is a very famous poem that you probably heard in grade school. It's called Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. And this section is about the sound of the horse bells in the silence of the night, in the silence of the wind and the snowflakes. So I'm just going to read you 2 stanzas. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The third example of imagery we're going to use is imagery with your eyes. And this comes from another famous book called 1984 by George Orwell. And this is a dystopian novel which talks about pervasive surveillance in a society. If you've ever heard the phrase, Big Brother is watching you, that is an allusion to 1984. So here's a section from that novel. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. So you can picture that whole scene. So that was using your eyes. So we've got imagery using smell. And this comes from, I actually watched this movie years ago, and it was fantastically spooky. It's called Parfum, the story of a murderer. And it's about a serial killer who has an extraordinary sense of smell, and he works in the perfume industry. So if you ever get a chance to see that movie, don't. So again, this is imagery using the sense of smell. You ready? In the period of which we speak, there reigned in the city a stench barely conceivable to us modern men and women. The streets stank of manure, the courtyard of urine, the stairwells stank of moldering wood and rat droppings, the kitchens of spoiled cabbage and pork fat. The unaired parlors stank of stale dust, the bedrooms of greasy sheets, damp feather beds. The stench of sulfur rose from the chimneys, the stench of caustic lies from the tanneries, and from the slaughterhouses came the stench of congealed blood. People stank of sweat and unwashed clothes. From their mouths came the stench of rotting teeth, from their bellies that of onions, and from their bodies, if they were no longer very young, came the stench of rancid cheese and sour milk and tumorous disease. Well, that's pleasant, isn't it? So those are examples of how to use imagery. I'm going to talk to you about your two-choice exploration assignments, and then your independent practice. And again, if you have any questions, email me at any time. Excuse me. The first choice exploration assignment is reading comprehension. I chose this poem because it was just written. This was recently written by a contemporary poet. His name is Lee Herrick, and he is a Korean-American college professor living in California, and he wrote it about the pandemic, and it's called The Birds Outside My Window Sing During a Pandemic. And you need to read this poem, and there are 5 questions to answer. You may not understand the poem because it's a little confusing, but you're really just answering questions about imagery. For example, besides birds, what can you hear when you read this poem? So don't overlook this just because you might not understand the poem. Look at the questions and then make your judgment. So that's choice exploration assignment number 1. Okay. Choice exploration assignment number 2, I'm calling imagery of your favorite place. And what I've done is I've given you a table that have the 5 senses at the top of it. see, touch, feel, taste, smell, and hear. And you're going to fill that chart in based on a favorite place. And I provided an example. I chose a favorite place is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I went there on vacation with my children and my husband a few years ago and stayed at a condo that my sister-in-law owns, and it really was a wonderful experience. And so I filled in my imagery chart based on that. Now I have a note here and it says choose your favorite place in nature that you've been on vacation or you just go to get away from the daily grind. So maybe you've never been on vacation or you don't have a favorite vacation spot. Maybe you go down by the train tracks to think, or maybe you go to the lake to think, or maybe you just walk in your neighborhood when you need to get alone, or you go to the monument. So pick a favorite place outside. And if you don't have a favorite place in reality, you can use your imagination to create a fantasy destination. Also, some of you did the tropical island research a few weeks back. I've always wanted to go to Bora Bora, so that might be something that you could do. So you're going to fill the columns in using your 5 senses, and later you could use this information to write the poem that you have to write. Okay? So let me go over that. So those are the 2 choices, reading comprehension with questions or the chart. So for independent practice, you're going to have to write a free verse poem using imagery. And I've read you plenty of examples. And if you need some more help, email me. That's why I'm here. So you're going to choose your topic. Perhaps stick with your favorite place because that's what you looked at during your choice exploration. You want to choose the mood that you're trying to convey. Is your poem going to be peaceful? Is it going to be angry? Is it going to just be like a picture with words? How do you want to convey that? You're going to use figurative language in your poem. Hyperbole, which is exaggeration. Alliteration, which is the repetition of the beginning sounds of words, like she sells seashells, that's alliteration. Using personification, you know what that is. Using simile or metaphor. And you're going to try to paint a word picture instead of telling a story. Narrative poem, which we did 2 weeks ago, was telling a story. This is painting a word picture. It also might tell a story as well. So your directions are to write a free verse poem of at least 15 lines. You're going to use examples of imagery. You're going to engage your 5 senses, see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. You're going to incorporate examples of other types of figurative language if you can. And your poem should not be a rhyming poem. And I wrote an example of a free verse poem using imagery. And I want to show you the picture. I hope you can see it. It's actually somebody fishing at sunrise. And that's really what my poem is about. When we went to Myrtle Beach, this actually happened. I woke my children up at like 4:45 and we went down to the beach at 5 to watch the sunrise, and they really didn't want to go. They just wanted to sleep. I think they'd gone to bed late the night before. And we ended up seeing the most spectacular sunrise I've ever seen, and also this image of a man in the distance fishing, and it just looked like a shadow, and the way that his fishing rod was, it looked like he was fishing for the sunrise. So this is a free verse poem, and I've used some similes, I've used some alliteration, and I've also used imagery from different seaside. See, hear, taste, smell, touch. You know what I'm saying. So I call this poem Fishing the Sunrise. We tumbled out of bed at 5, grumbling and grumpy. We wondered what on earth we were doing up so early on vacation. Like the crabs we had seen yesterday, we scurried to the elevator and silently rode the 21 floors down. The beach was silent, but for the waves. Hushed, we walked, huddled, heads bent to the sand, and wore the darkness like hoods. The first pink of color peaked the horizon. We started to awaken, our voices one voice of admiration. And as we walked, our hearts opened to the morning. The sun started to show its face, the most dazzling display of orange and red. And in the distance, a fisherman cast his line, his silhouette danced on the sunrise, and he pulled until the sun rose fully. So that is my free verse poem using imagery. So hopefully, just to reiterate what we did today, we did illusion Narcissus, and that was illusion number 8. We talked about free verse poetry, what it was. I read 3 examples. We talked about imagery, and I read 4 examples. I went over both choice exploration assignments. I went over the independent practice. So you have 3 assignments. One is to read this week's illusion again and comment on Schoology in the discussion board area. Comments must be relevant and appropriate to get credit. You have to complete one of the choice exploration assignments and complete the independent practice, writing a free verse poem using imagery. This is all due next Monday, but please, in the name of all that is good and right in the world, get your homework done as soon as possible, okay? English is on Tuesday, so you really should be watching my videos on Tuesday and getting your English done on Tuesday, handing it in on Tuesday, so I can grade it Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and not have to worry about the last minute kind of stuff. And that way I won't have to keep calling you at home or sending you emails to remind you to get your work in. Alright guys, that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again next Tuesday.